Good morning, everybody. It's This Week in XR with Charlie Fink. I'm here with Ted Schilowitz. It is June 17th, 2022. Good morning, Ted.
Morning, Charlie.
Oh, I should say, as always, our show is brought to you by Virbela. And good morning to you, Virbela, and everybody out there in podcast land. We have a great guest today, Justin Barad, founder and CEO of Osso VR, the surgical simulator being used now by medical schools all over the world. So I'm looking forward to chatting with him. He has taught me a lot over the years. He's an incredible entrepreneur and also a practicing physician himself. He's an orthopedic surgeon and a former game developer. How's that for a pedigree to run Osso VR?
Pretty good. And this sector, as you and I have talked about a number of times, is really starting to mature. This isn't on the edges anymore. This technology is starting to become a mainstream use case for the medical side of the world. So
well, everybody gets their own cadaver and they get to take it home with them.
Exactly. And cut it up over and over again to their heart's content.
Exactly. So an incredible, strange week where Meta and Apple did not swallow the entire news cycle with announcements. So interesting things happened this week, and actually kind of a weird theme in a way. I think if you read the column, I kick it off with this discussion of a very meta thing.
Yeah.
And I think meta also having to do both with the Greek word meta as well as the actual evolving metaverse.
Yes, you must be referring to the Squid Game of Squid Games. Am I correct here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a competition. They just started it. I think you can still sign up and audition. And of course, you know how these things go. The auditions, of course, become part of the show. So they're in production. They're going to run it simultaneous with the launch of Squid Game 2 next year.
Yeah.
And I just, you just got to go there, right? I mean, why aren't they doing this in VR?
Yeah, I mean, my instinct is this is going to be a big hit. That show obviously touched sort of this darker part of humanity that is in everybody to some extent, and when it's exposed correctly through the art and artistry of Korean cinema, which has become a real sort of darling of the industry these days. It'll be really interesting their take on it, and the prize is not insignificant. It's a serious amount of money that one person.
No. Well, 300 with 456 participants, it's going to take a long time to winnow that group down. Yeah. And they'll have to do it pretty quickly because otherwise no production can have the resources. It's sort of like American Idol, right? There are 1,000 people who audition for American Idol. We only see a handful of them that they decided were the most telegenic or interesting or, had a further plot line for them.
Yeah, and we are all you and I are into the LARP world, right? To a certain extent, and
that's a live action role playing game.
Yes, for those of you at home. For those that are not familiar with the term LARP, the idea of taking something that obviously had the highest level of awful circumstances and consequences, which is death, and creating this kind of horror experience that will probably feel fairly real to those contestants.
Well, being sent home is a certain kind of death, is it not?
And look, I mean, people have done this in many ways, right? I mean, the horror tropes in the idea of a location-based, haunted houses are a very important part of our legacy as people that love theme attractions and theme parks, and the more real it feels.
And of course, those were the virtual reality of their day, right? They use stagecraft for immersion where they couldn't use obviously the technologies that we have access to.
Yeah, so we would have to postulate that maybe within the show itself, they'll use virtual reality or mixed reality to put people into circumstances. I mean, I think the closest thing I could go back to from a traditional mainstream broadcast television model is, remember the show Fear Factor?
Oh yeah,
years ago, my neighbors actually worked on Fear Factor because, of course, we live in
Well, this is again the convergence of television and AR to create these live experiences rather than ones that are made by special effects experts in post-production. So they've got to do, use real-time game engines and all sorts of other technologies. So they're all influencing each other and creating this new kind of cross digital, physical, broadcast technologies. So I think it's a pretty interesting example of where we could be going with entertainment, and particularly, streaming entertainment and reality television.
Right, absolutely.
So other interesting news this week: Blipper, our friends at Blipper, who were pioneers in computer vision, pivoted from advertising, pivoting back to advertising. They have an advertising tool set that they market to enterprises so they can make their own AR. But they also have made a deal with Microsoft, specifically Teams, to integrate that technology into Teams. So rather than using, for example, Campfire, which uses headsets and magnetic trackers,
bespoke technology to do that.
Yeah, instead they're using smartphones and QR codes. So you're just snapping the QR code off of Teams and then using your phone to take that content and put it in your own space, on your desktop, in your room, where you now have a way using mobile AR to walk around it, and you're sharing this in real time with the other participants in the call, who presumably also clicked that QR code. So pretty interesting application for Microsoft Teams. And of course, Microsoft has said that, Teams is their, workplace play, in the same way that Meta has this tiny little thing, called Workrooms. You've got this giant thing called Teams that's used by 250 million people every day.
By enterprises across the world. Yeah. And Blipper is one of those interesting companies I refer to as a keep on keeping on company, right? They've lived through all the ups and downs and sideways of this emerging market, and keep finding moments where they can stay relevant and stay in business, which is very impressive.
And we had the CEO. We had the CEO on the show last year, Fazal Galaria.
Yeah, I mean, it's an impressive group, right? Because it's not an easy business when you're trying to keep finding those veins of usefulness and veins of economic viability. So
and this space of bespoke tools for small and medium-sized enterprises, on a SaaS model, has a lot of competitors in it.
Right.
I won't go into them in a story about Blipper, but the people are fishing where the fish are, and it seems like they're getting a very big boost in that competition by teaming up with Microsoft. So good on them. I got a tour. You remember Engage, the education platform being used by many secondary schools and universities, including Stanford, and it announced last fall that it was making the LinkedIn of the metaverse. So nobody really, people say shit all the time. So whatever, okay, we reported it. And this week they started giving press and potential clients or existing clients a tour of a product they now call Link. And it's super, super interesting. They've got everything they currently have, classrooms, lecture halls, exhibition halls.
Right.
They also have now more social spaces, coffee shops. They've added to that office buildings and apartments. You can have an apartment and live, on the 10th floor and have a view of all these floating mountains around you. And each of them has a little city on it. And some of those will be branded and they'll belong to companies, and some of them will be open spaces that you can teleport to. So they've really embraced this idea of linking places that are both useful and places that are purely social together. And they're pushing hard in the way they're engineering the community to have a community of verified adults.
Right.
So they're going to charge $10 a month, not because they're greedy, but because they think it's important to establish a commercial, trusted, and encrypted identity that goes around with you. It moderates behavior, it enables e-commerce, and most importantly, it basically calls out the kids and the unserious people. It's not very much money, but it's enough that if you weren't using it, you'd probably cancel.
Yeah, it's a gate, right? Yeah. And these, it's interesting, that type of product and these things that we're starting to see the glimmers of are really the real metaverse. Like the idea of what's kind of happening when we reflect back on our Web 2.0 heritage is when the kind of idea of websites started to become this thing that, well, of course you have a website and of course you have a presence on the web. And these are the beginnings of that, right? And there are a number of different companies that are dancing around this idea of permanence, that you're going to have a place on the Web3 version of the internet that if you're advanced enough, you'll be using it in a headset. And I presume it's somewhat cross-platform, Charlie?
It's PC, it's PC and VR, both
right?
Quest and PC VR.
Right. So you can go into it from a normal compute environment and an advanced compute environment.
Yes.
And, you know, once we start to see not just 5 or 10 of these, but hundreds, if not thousands of these sort of spaces, then it's going to start to become like an understood thing that this is the next part of the web.
I think the question,
I've seen that a little before.
I think the question here is, right, who is going to make the thing that everyone flocks to?
Right, right.
And, you know, who is going to build that tool that allows everybody to have a reasonable website?
Mm-hmm.
So
the Squarespace of it all, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think you've got enough hysteria and FOMO around the metaverse that it kind of could work. I'll give you an example. You know, Chapman, where I teach, as you can imagine, is having, like probably every major institution, a metaverse freak out.
Sure.
Like, what do we do?
What do we do? How do we do it? Where do we spend the money? Who do we hire? All that stuff.
I mean, they're just, I don't even think they're quite there yet, but I'm not, you know, there's also a lot of different parts of the university that no doubt are not talking to each other. So this will all come to a head. And when it comes to a head, one of the things on the table will be, well, let's not be idiots. It's hard. So let's start small. Let's do what Stanford did. Let's have a little branded place with a couple of lecture halls and maybe a fake football stadium. And, you know, if it works and we're still using it a year later, yeah, and anybody on this campus has cared, then maybe we'll build more. Right. So I think it's an interesting way to kind of get people up on training wheels. They can say they're doing metaverse. I don't think you can call Engage as a centralizer. It is not. It is the opposite of Web3. But as we have also discussed, you know, a Web3 environment may not be right for everything. Mm-hmm. Right? A Web3, you know, I like my bundled Apple services. I'm not looking to have that disrupted by an unaccountable protocol. Mm-hmm. You know, let me deal with my relationship with Apple and how trusted or not trusted they are. Right? I mean, they're more trusted to me than an anonymous protocol that no one controls.
Right. But all the things you're talking about are these little peg points that we can go back in time and look at how, as you mentioned, like who's going to emerge as the leaders in the sector, the thing that everybody just chooses to use, right? And those are these interesting human dynamics that are hard to define. But as people keep chewing on the monster, just like happened with, you know, every website trying to find its way, and then these various services, and then we look at, well, Google was the one that emerged, right? But it certainly wasn't the first, and it wasn't the last. And others that kind of become sector leaders. Now we're seeing enough energy around all of these different companies trying to find their virtual presence beyond just a traditional web presence within the use case. And they know, like from a university standpoint, they know how much online services are being used, right? And how much time people are spending in a web environment versus a physical environment, even when they're on campus. So those are known issues, right? In their dorm rooms and so forth and so on. And of course, you know, people like us are using these kind of tools all day long. So there's continued impetus, there's continued investment. And in the years to come, we're going to see who emerges as the ones that really own the space. Like we mentioned Teams earlier, we're on Zoom right now. You know, Apple has their own ecosystem to do this. Epic has their own ecosystem to do these things. There'll likely be 10 or 15 real Web3 superstars and thousands of pseudo superstars, and then hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people that just have a presence because it's so cheap and easy to have a presence, just like we have on the web today.
So you remember that Pico was purchased by ByteDance, the company that owns TikTok.
Right. They're making a play, right? They're making
there's been news this week. They opened up a number of positions in the US, which can tell us a bit about their strategy. So they're trying to put together a game studio, as well as people who as well, people who would market games, marketing organization. It's all in the West Coast, Seattle and the Bay Area. And, something like 45 positions. So not nothing, I don't think like we're going to go after Quest 2 with 45 new positions. But it seems like they're, trying to open up the consumer market for the Pico Neo 3. And it seems like, at least based on what I've read, I've not used, I have a Neo 3. I've not used it with a PC, but supposedly using it with a PC is a little better than the Quest 2. And if that's true, a $500 headset could find a place in this ecosystem.
Right, with a wireless link to your PC and all kinds of goodness that way. Yeah. You would, it's interesting because we know instinctively that someone has to give the Meta Quest some sort of valid competition, even if it's at a level that Meta's going to throw so much money at it and so much marketing dollars and so much resources at something that they're going to own it just by the dollars they put in it. But sometimes the smaller group that's a little leaner can actually make an impact, right?
Well, look at what Steam has done with the Valve Index.
Absolutely.
They're not selling millions of them. I think they've sold about 1 million of them. That's a lot. I mean, that's a lot of money. And they're charging $1,000. It is not a loss leader.
Yeah. And it's for that customer that wants that experience and wants to be in that ecosystem. So, you and I know that having only one ecosystem is not a good thing, right? I mean,
for sure,
tech giants would say that they want to own it all, but truthfully,
and honestly, there are a lot of people who have no interest in the metaverse, period, but who are interested in VR and are still believers, but they want a device that they can control. And so I think that may be a place for the Neo. I hope so. Diversity is good. So Justin is ready to come in. Let's bring him in.
Okay, great.
So everybody, just to remind you, this is Justin Barad. He's the founder and CEO of Osso VR, which does surgical simulations for training both today's surgeons and tomorrow's surgeons. Justin is also a practicing orthopedic surgeon and also a former game programmer. So
probably a traditional radio host by the
I know. Well, probably the most qualified XR CEO there is. Welcome to the show. Good to see you, Justin.
Wow, what an introduction. That was quite the way to start today. Thanks for having me.
We're pleased to have you. Congratulations on all the continued success.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's been a wild ride and plenty more to go, but so happy with where we are.
I mean, you guys in the past 6 months have just pulled down probably twice as much as you had previously raised in the last 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty close to accurate. It's crazy to think about, but
I mean, the first time we talked was in early 2017.
Yeah, I think, we were probably like, single digits back then. So, everything starts from somewhere. And, this started from an idea and a sort of a deep passion for a problem that, really interestingly, around 2016, when we got started, I felt was a growing and imminent existential challenge for healthcare. And, we're starting to see that today, which is, it's not great to see problems get worse, but it accelerated much more quickly than anybody thought. And now one of the key challenges we have with healthcare delivery is related to the speed at which we could train up healthcare professionals and the quality that they're able to provide. And it's a huge challenge right now. And VR is, it would be great if it was further along, but it is really helping. There are very few people who have not used Osso VR in some capacity, either in practice or during their formal training at this point, which, I mean, even I'm kind of surprised to hear. It's like amazing. Yeah. People are like, oh yeah, I use this. I'm like, oh, wow, that's incredible.
So for our listeners, go back and give the elevator pitch on what Osso VR is so they understand before we start to dive in deep. Give us the blush on what you do and how you do it so they understand how important it is and what's happening.
Yeah, no problem. To do the virtual elevator pitch here. So, as you guys mentioned, I started out my career in video game development at Game Credit with Activision, which I was very proud of. And I had an introduction into the world of healthcare through a family member that became quite ill. And, honestly, I just woke up one day and I was like, hey, is there a way to use software and technology, not necessarily for entertainment, but to help people? And so I ended up pursuing biomedical engineering with this like strong desire to invent new healthcare technology. But I didn't know how to get started with invention. So I was kind of asking around for advice. And this one mentor told me something that really sticks with me to this day. He said, "Hey, Justin, if you want to invent something, you really need to understand the problem you're trying to solve first." And he thought that one of the best ways to understand medical problems was to be a doctor. So I took his advice like really
Oh,
literally.
that's easy.
I did not know. I had no idea what I was signing up for, I think, in retrospect, but, went to med school, became an orthopedic surgeon. And then, as I'm going through my training, I'm in surgeries, and it's not all the time, but it was enough that it raised an eyebrow where people would be like, "Hey, Justin, can you kind of scrub out, maybe Google what to do? Like, we haven't done this in a while. We've never done this surgery before." And I'm like, wow, that's pretty interesting. So started to kind of understand like why that seemed to be happening and more and more. And what I found is really kind of three core pre-pandemic dynamics. One is there's just too much to learn. So like we've gone from French Laundry to Cheesecake Factory, right? Accelerating science and technology is just like blown up the library procedures we're expected to know how to do in demand. One day I was asked to operate on a gorilla with like a 1 hour heads up, which was a whole podcast in itself. Like that's a wild story, but we're dealing with gorilla-like situations of what feels like a daily basis now in healthcare. Number two is modern surgery, modern procedures are way more complicated than they used to be. So all of these newer things that people are very excited about, like robotics, minimally invasive surgery, the learning curve is like 10 times longer. You have to do it 50 to 100 times to do it at a minimum proficiency level instead of 10 to 20. And then finally, what is very surprising for people to learn is we really lack a way to objectively assess technical skills in healthcare. Unlike aviation, where you train on a simulator every 6 months and just get rechecked that you're good to go. Whereas in my career, the one objective check I had, I was asked to play the board game Operation and remove some pieces without buzzing, which I did. And I'm actually kind of proud of, but that's sort of state of the art at the moment. And then obviously, down the line, the pandemic really accelerated things. But around this time, I got involved in VR with the Oculus DK1 because of my gaming background and passion. I'm like, wow, what an incredible solution. You can anytime, anywhere, train on any procedure, use your hands. It's affordable, portable. You can get realistic cutaneous haptic feedback. You can train as a team and train remotely, which is, as we were saying earlier, a huge issue right now, and then get objective assessment. So kind of built the first prototype for Osso in 2016 with the mission to improve patient outcomes, increase the adoption of higher value surgical techniques and technologies, and democratize access to surgical education. I met my co-founder on the internet, paid him with some savings for my bar mitzvah. Thank you, Grandma. And, some investors caught interest and, got dropped out of Stanford, went full-time in 2016 to try and solve a problem. Once again, that I care more about probably more than anything in my life outside of maybe pizza.
So you glossed over kind of an interesting moment in your life's journey. You said you basically became a physician. You became a orthopedic surgeon. Is this a correct statement? Am I?
Yeah, I still am. I practice on weekends at
That's
Orthopedic Institute for Children at UCLA, doing pediatric orthopedic trauma, so broken bones in kids, monkey bars, and that sort of thing.
Right. So you're a practicing physician right now and
Yes.
pursuing this technological layer from the best point of access, which is understanding what you as a physician actually need to accomplish, and how you train and how you learn. And I like you made that reference to the flight simulator and aviation world, because simulation in aviation is the order of the day. Like, you don't get into a commercial jet without going through many, many, many hours of simulation. And because of the logic of a cabin that we can build either physically with screens and heads up displays and haptics, right, and a sort of like a theme park style haptic system with the hydraulics, what you're doing is using virtual reality technology to sort of bring that same level of simulation to various surgical environments, right? And give us a sense of who's training, the kind of scale that you have. Like, what are the real world sort of use cases of how this is being used on the kind of scale and scope of what you're seeing right now?
Well, in terms of who is using our product, we're training everybody, but I would say the core group is what I would call the early career surgeon. So this is an area not a lot of people know about, but when you finish your formal, you go to med school, your college med school for 4 years, at least in the US, and then you do your formal training. So this is internship or residency, and then fellowship, which, can be like 5 to 8 years, depending on how much you do. And that's really where you're learning to do surgery. You don't learn really anything sort of surgery wise in med school. But once you're done with that and you're out in practice, that's actually where it gets really hard. Because what you're doing, in effect, is opening a restaurant. You see, I use a lot of like food analogies. And so the first part of opening a restaurant is you're like, okay, what am I going to put on the menu? You know, what procedures am I going to offer my patients? Because they're like infinite to pull from now. There's so many. So that in itself is kind of a big challenge to understand what's out there. Because the vast majority of it, you will not even have seen a single time in your training. It's just, there's too much. You can't get that big of a slice. Then the next step is you actually have to learn how to do those procedures. And we talked about the learning curve is like 50 to 100 cases, and you're doing this like very rapidly in a very short period of time. So it's a lot of pressure. And so that is where our platform is really most frequently being utilized right now, where surgeons are using Osso VR to explore and discover new procedures and understand, you know, what should they be offering their patients, what do they feel like they'll be good at and be able to deliver effectively, and then using it to then learn how to do those procedures. And it's not replacing in-person training. What it's doing is making it much more effective. Whereas we used to do these very expensive cadaver labs where you get a bunch of people together in a hotel ballroom and maybe they have a wedding or bar mitzvah later that night. It's kind of a weird dynamic. And you're practicing on these people who have donated their bodies. It's like an amazing sacrifice and commitment, but it is rep 1 of 100 rep learning curve.
Mm-hmm.
And the data shows us you're going to forget 90% of what you learned within a week. So it's like, you know, you're going to like the grand finale way too early. You know, you're just kind of blowing your wad on a very expensive, important event. And so what we do is we pre-train in Osso. You work your way up 60 to 80% of the learning curve. And we have, I think now 5 or 6 peer-reviewed studies that show that this improves your performance anywhere from 200 to 300%. So it's very effective. And then you go to that in-person training and you've turned it from an introduction to a master class. Now you're just refining your skills with a much higher level of retention and then going on to do this procedure in patients. And in terms of sort of scale, we're being used in well over 30 countries, and we train in any given month, maybe around 4,000 to up to 5,000 healthcare professionals in a month.
Well, and that's an exact reference again to the aviation industry, right? You train in the simulator, you get more and more sophisticated, you build up your muscles, and then they put you in the real thing and you get up into this multi-million-dollar device that has human hearts and souls in it and get it up in the air for real, right?
I mean, hopefully, I guess pig hearts and souls eventually with some of the transplant technologies being developed.
Similar parable.
But
yeah,
I think, you know, one of the key differences with aviation is that, you know, it's a very sort of defined set of things that you'll be dealing with in aviation. There are these low frequency, high urgency situations you need to be prepared for, but you kind of know what you need to know. Whereas in healthcare, it's kind of like a very much broader pool. And so to give you an example, I remember in fellowship, I had, you know, I was training at Boston Children's Hospitals, like very subspecialized, like #1 peds ortho institution in the world. And I had a pediatric congenital hand, like right hand surgeon, basically, right? The equivalent of that, who was covering call. So basically just whatever comes in the door, you do those surgeries. And she like mainly operates on like babies and had this like, you know, 200-pound 18-year-old with an open femur fracture come in. She runs to me. She's like, I haven't done this surgery in like 2 to 3 years. I wish there was a way and it's going in like 20 minutes. I wish there was a way I could like kind of do it a couple of times and just sort of get comfortable with it again before I do it on like a human being. But I just, at that time, this didn't exist. And now we can do that. And it's like, that's really fascinating. It's like, you know, that scene in The Matrix where, you know, they plug themselves in, learn how to fly a helicopter. It does feel like that a little bit. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, I mean, that's real invention, right? And innovation is there's a need, there's a real represented need that someone brought to you and you said, yes, I have the right tool for this. So I have a question related to your touch point you talked about the game operation. And maybe you're doing this and maybe you're not, or maybe you're thinking about it, but it'll be interesting for our listeners to know this. So as you're delivering this professional product into the professional world with obviously professional price tags and the way that you maintain it, are you thinking about kind of opening up and gamifying this and letting regular folks that own a Quest play your version of VR operation and actually kind of try out what it feels like to do an orthopedic surgeon, to do a heart surgery, to do a brain surgery? Is that an aspiration of yours? And if it's not, would it be an aspiration of yours after we start talking about it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. First of all, we're all human. We're all regular folks, right? We're all the same. Doctors sort of breathe and eat pizza just like the rest of us. I would say actually this is something we've done for quite some time. We did an open innovation challenge with the U.S. Department of Education to see if we can leverage immersive technologies to provide better and more accessible what's called career exploration for high school students and college students. And actually, Osso VR ended up winning that challenge. And I think part of why we won is, I see this firsthand, especially in my own specialty of orthopedic surgery, which is like horrifically misrepresented especially from a gender standpoint. It's getting a lot better, but if you look at data from like 2014, which is a little while ago now, something like 4% of practicing orthopedic surgeons were women, which is like kind of insane to think about. I don't think there's any other profession that has that much of a mismatch. And so people are like, why is this happening? And what they found is that people were applying for orthopedics way too late because they didn't realize that they liked it or that it existed. And the people that were applying, they were applying because their parents were orthopedic surgeons or their neighbors were. It's the kind of people that you grow up around or that you see this thing. And so if we could provide opportunities earlier on to medical students who are women or in other underrepresented groups, they're more likely to apply. And if you extrapolate that, well, in med school and college, and high school, if we can provide these experiences to people that don't know surgery exists, that don't know what the different specialties are, that don't know what neurosurgery is or ENT is, or anesthesia, or even being a radiology technician or a surgical tech or a PA, an advanced care provider. Like there's just like a really wide world of really exciting jobs that feel like science fiction. My first day of surgery, I thought I was like, it was a fever dream because I'm like, this can't be real. Because we were doing the surgery from Gattaca, and I still think it's like one of the most wild days of my life. And so I say, yes, our goal is we're working on some things to give access to Osso VR to everybody so that people can try these different careers and we can attract people back to healthcare. Because I don't know for sure, but I'm starting to feel that we're getting a little bit of brain drain because, one, you don't have people that are aware that these things exist. Two, if you are aware, you look at a career in healthcare, especially something like surgery, which takes 14 to 16 years to just like get a job. And then something like technology, where like in a couple of years, suddenly like you're a VP running a team and you're having a similar, if not bigger impact in a much lower amount of time without kind of like needing a lot of therapy and blowing up your life. So you're looking at those two things. What rational person would choose this thing over here? And so we really need to level the playing field. We need to get more smarter, brighter people applying, but we also need to look at like, hey, does it really take this much? Can we use technologies like Osso and other technologies? And maybe like NYU now, it's 3 years for med school. Why can't it be 2? And, part of the reason why residency is so long is it was developed a century ago by William Halsted at Johns Hopkins, partially to hide his cocaine and morphine addiction, which we can talk about in another podcast, which is really interesting, which ended up working really well. So it worked out, but it's starting to show its age. And part of the reason it's so long is because you're just sitting around waiting for surgery to happen. Well, if we can make surgery happen virtually, maybe we don't need to sit around for as long. Maybe we can shave a year off. Maybe we can shave 2 years off. And Canada has actually done some work with what's called competency-based training that does just that. And suddenly now we've shaved 3 years, maybe 4 years off of training. We've made it a lot more futuristic, a lot more higher quality. And suddenly this looks like an attractive field again. And also we've increased the top of funnel, the pipeline, because we've gotten people really excited about it. So the answer to your question, maybe a little too in depth there, but yeah, I think about it a lot.
So
yeah, go ahead, Charlie.
So I was going to say, you have a great radio voice, Justin. We have to have you maybe as a guest host. I was thinking while you were talking two things. One is I hope you can share with us a little bit about who the customer is, right? Who's buying? I mean, you were talking a few minutes ago about who the user is, but I'd be interested in who the customer is. Who's buying the simulators? How do you sell them? Are there accessories? I think there's a company called Fundamental VR that makes sort of a little robotic scalpel that gives you feedback. Tell us if you can attack both of those, the accessory or haptic part of it, as well as the economic part of it.
Yeah, no, ultimately the ultimate beneficiary of our technology is the patient, right? That's what we're really focused on. And then, our users are healthcare professionals, but how does the business work? So, early on, and these questions are actually really tied together, so I'm glad you asked both. when I was thinking about Osso VR, the idea of simulation is not new. I'm not like, it doesn't take a genius to be like, hey, maybe practicing on like living humans is not like the best course of action, right? So, simulators have existed for a long time, but as a business, they were mainly being sold to hospitals. And you would have, often they incorporated some sort of kinesthetic force feedback, some sort of haptic feedback. And there were these big, bulky simulators like $100,000, $200,000. And, maybe a hospital would buy one, a residency program would buy one. I've never seen one buy two, but I guess it's possible. but what is the value proposition of one simulator for a hospital, right? How much revenue is that helping them bring in? How much is that improving outcomes? How much cost is that saving? And so, I was curious about this. So I went to one of the top simulation labs, maybe in the world. And this lab is like, has every technology. It's like unbelievable. They have a simulated space station pod where you can simulate real space surgery, without the microgravity, but everything else. Even like an accurate star map outside the window I don't see how that helps, but it's cool. And I'm like, how often do people come here? This is incredible. And they're like, well, if we're lucky, maybe once a year. And so like, how much is that really helping, right? And how much of a perpetual motion machine of a business, how much of flywheel can you really get going to, the business model is what distributes your technology around the world. You have to create this like product market fit that creates this hockey stick type adoption curve. And so I'm like, okay, this selling to hospitals doesn't seem to be working. But at the same time, I am being flown all around the world by Johnson & Johnson, by Stryker, by Smith & Nephew to try and train me on these newer technologies so that I can bring them to patients. Because if you don't know how to drive a car, you're not going to buy a car, right? And so these companies actually train us and spend billions of dollars a year training us. And so they'll take us to one of these labs. These labs are very expensive. They'll cost like $200,000, $300,000 for a 1 to 2 day course where you get maybe 1 to 2 repetitions, typically on a cadaver. And then when are you doing the actual operation on a patient? Next week, 2 weeks? It's actually sometimes like 3 to 6 months later, because you have to find the right patient and the device needs to be approved by the hospital, something called a value analysis committee. And so now just put yourself in a surgeon's shoes. You're operating on a patient, the device you used one time 6 months ago with a learning curve of 100 cases. How is that going to go? And those are the cases where they're like, hey, Google what to do. It's a dumpster fire. And like by the end of it, you're like, oh my God, this feels unsafe. Like, let's just stick to the older stuff. Like, I don't want to put patients at risk because we really don't at the end of the day. So I saw that was not working. And I'm like, hey, maybe we can offer this technology to the medical device industry to increase the adoption of these newer technologies and also increase their utilization. Because a lot of times hospitals will buy a robot but never use it because no one knows how to actually
that's crazy, right? Because where else could you do the simulation more directly than through a screen, right? When you're doing these robotic surgeries,
right? Well,
somebody else has their eyes on the patient. The doctor is operating the simulator.
There are many reasons why robotics, this is the counterintuitive point. It's much harder to learn, and it's these robots. Like if I wanted to come train you, Charlie, and I'm not going to fly you out to me, I would need to send 300-pound shipping containers with an engineer to calibrate it when he gets there and set it up, or she. It's like it's wild to even just get your hands on one of these things is very difficult, especially during COVID times. So that was how we initially positioned Osso, and that was a wild success. We work with Johnson & Johnson, we work with Smith & Nephew, we work with Stryker, we work with Zimmer Biomet, all the majors in orthopedics, and then the interventional space is also now a major focus for us. So, we do aortic valve replacement, EVAR, we're starting in the neurovascular space, interventional urology. So working with the medical device industry has been a huge success. Now, part of the approach and part of what we identified is that, hey, we're not going to take the huge custom force feedback simulator approach, because the issue that I saw, it was the challenge is not that it's not realistic enough. The challenge is that because it's not portable and not affordable, that you only have it in a small location that you would need to go to. And we talked about people are only going once a year at best. And, so why is that happening? Well, put yourself in my shoes. I just finished my call shift. I've been in the hospital maybe somewhere between 30 to 35 hours. And then they're like, hey, by the way, Justin, why don't you go drive 8 miles to the simulation lab and get a few reps in? And I'm like, have you lost your mind? I'm like, I might die just on the drive home. Because like one day I was trying to like pull into my driveway. I kept falling asleep as I was like turning in, and I like had to circle the block 8 times. It was like terrifying. So I'm like, and I would like to see my family at some point, maybe eat something. So it's like, we're working extreme hours. We don't have the luxury of driving somewhere. If you need to go through a door to get access training, you're not going to use it, right? It might as well be on a different planet. And so to me,
Justin, let me ask you, I want to ask you a very specific question. I know you're going down a line of thought, but
I can pause the rant. I can resume.
I want to
in a
hone
bit.
in on some very specific things. So, and this will be a very specific question, right? As someone who has been through a Davinci procedure, are you at the level, and are you, as one of the medical companies that you mentioned and talk about, where you have a virtual Davinci inside Osso VR where someone can train on, because that's one of the most popular robotic systems for very sophisticated surgeries. Are you at that level of deliverables on something like this, or with other devices that are at that level?
Yeah, well, I mean, we work with I don't even know how many surgical robots at this point. So we have many robots on the platform that you can do end-to-end surgeries and procedures with. I'm going to touch on that in a bit.
Okay.
But once again, so the key challenge here is accessibility.
Right.
It is critical that we can just carry this technology with us, that everyone can use it, and we can use it every single day in between cases while we're sitting there. Like sometimes we're just sitting there for an hour or two while.
So this is all about the portability of the Quest, as opposed to getting, for example, photorealism and adding a lot of haptics. It's more important for it to be simple and scalable and shippable and
accessible.
Sitting there.
Accessible and affordable and scalable, yes. And so that everyone can use this. And talk about photorealism in a bit if you like, because that actually was an interesting discovery where we found that was more important than we thought. But
I would think in surgery it would be hugely important, because the thing you have to get a look at is the thing you can't see.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an element of clinical accuracy, but there's also an element here of behavior change. Like you can have the best technology in the world. And I always say, I have an expression, data is not enough. It's not enough to just show that it works. You got to get people to use it. And so how do you pull them in? And part of that is the artistry of the visuals and creating something that's stunning and jaw-dropping. And there's actually thousands of years of precedent for using art to drive change in medicine. But back to this sort of accessibility component, there's an obsession with force feedback and the idea of surgical simulation. Every human being I've ever spoken to has a very strong image of what this should be, and I did too. And I think I really realized that maybe I wasn't thinking about this the right way when I wanted to try the best haptic feedback that was out there, because I'm like, this has to be really realistic to use this, right? So I'm going to go use the Davinci robot to really see what top of the line haptic feedback is. So I go to use a Davinci. I'm like, kind of like, moving these little things on pegs, I'm suturing, and I turn to the rep. I'm like, wow, the haptics on this feel unbelievable. Like, how did you guys do this? I could feel the tension of the suture. I could do this so precisely. And they're like, oh, the Davinci has no haptic feedback at all. I'm surprised you didn't know that.
It's your brain putting it all together, right?
Yeah, felt like a bit of an idiot, but yeah, like the brain is doing something called digital synesthesia or sense substitution and filling in the gap. So I'm like, well, what does the research seem to show? Because this is like kind of nuts. And if you look at the past 20 years of kinesthetic haptic feedback literature, the vast majority of studies, if you compare these like super high fidelity simulators with force feedback to things that have no haptic feedback at all, there is little to no difference in skill transfer. It does not seem to help for whatever reason. And secondly, people don't seem to like it. It feels weird. It suffers from uncanny valley effects. And so part of the reason why Davinci doesn't have any haptics is the number one requested feature was haptic feedback. But every time they gave them a prototype with haptics, people hated it. Finally, they're like, screw it. And they give them one with no haptics at all. And everyone loved it. And they're like, this feels great. And like, the human brain is a great mystery. Yeah. And so we are really overemphasizing something that has not proven to help. And when you remove that component, we can get this technology feasibly to every single healthcare professional in the world. There are 1.1 million surgeons around the world and like 20 to 30 million healthcare professionals that are involved in procedures. Imagine every single one of them is improving their performance 2 to 3x, maybe cutting their surgery time 20, 50%, 5xing their learning curves. Like this is a stepwise improvement in healthcare that is very rarely seen outside of things like vaccines or new drug categories, right? So it's all using video game technology. So it's so wild about this space. And that's why if you look at the area under the curve, scale and accessibility trumps these like minor improvements in fidelity and things like that by such a large margin that I'm like, we really need to focus on just getting the technology that exists today to everybody because it works really well. That's what the data shows. And now it's just more about getting people to use it every day as part of their practice. Now, I could talk about your question a little bit about like, simulating the robots and things like that, but any questions on that for you guys?
We're actually running out of time here.
Okay, well, maybe part
you
two.
are too good at giving this talk, but
I did a podcast simulation before this, so I felt uniquely prepared.
Let me ask you just a couple of short answer questions. How big is the company now?
We're over 200.
Whoa. And so what kind of simulations are you offering now in addition to the one you started with orthopedic surgery and those driven by device manufacturers? What have you got? How is your offering expanded?
Yeah, so I would say, Osso VR is a universal simulation platform. We can simulate any procedure with our unique core technology. I would say probably our key areas right now continue to be orthopedics, spine, any interventional procedure. So it's talking about structural heart, neurovascular, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Any robotic procedure. These are and endoscopy, I guess, as a category as well. These are big focus areas for us, but theoretically we can create any procedure.
And
I think the first time we talked in 2017, you were less than 10 people.
Yeah, you're growing massively, which is very exciting and a good provability that simulation does work in these fields. For the healthcare professionals, hopefully around the world that are listening to this and getting a link to it at some point when you share it, what would they expect from an economic standpoint, kind of the costing dynamics of this? Because it's obviously not consumer level stuff, and you're putting a huge amount of resources into the very accurate simulations of surgical procedures. How would they sort of either learn about what it costs or give them a set of just a blush of like, how much would they spend to sort of get themselves up and ready to use these things?
Well, like we talked about earlier, there's stuff coming down the road that's really exciting that, we can't share too much of to broaden the access. But right now, if you're a healthcare professional, you can go to Johnson & Johnson or Smith & Nephew or Stryker and get access to this technology at no cost.
Perfect.
You will get a headset and you'll be able to train in Osso VR and on bread and butter sort of common procedures, but also cutting edge and latest and greatest technologies.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have, Justin. Thank you for coming on the show. It, as always, is great to talk to you. Ted and everybody else, have a great weekend, and we'll see you next Friday. Again, thanks to our sponsor, Virbela, and we'll see you next Friday.
Cheers, everyone. Bye.